Melusine by Lynne Chapter 5, Learning to Milk. By milking time, Roger had learned an astonishing amount of French, or rather relearned it. He'd never really tried before. Arriving at the goat pen ahead of Melusine, he practiced his catching technique on a goat or two, and then he had an idea. There was some coarse string in shortish lengths hanging from a hook in the dairy. He'd noticed it this morning. He went in there and got some, and tucked it into the top of his shorts. Then he caught a goat, tied a piece of string to one of its horns, and attached it loosely to the fence. It tugged furiously once or twice, but Roger hastily pulled some grass from outside the fence and put it on the ground. The goat began to eat and forgot it was tied. Roger then pulled lots of grass till he had a fairly big heap. He stung his hands on some hidden nettles, but that didn't stop him. He strewed the grass in a line on the inside of the fence, and then set about his self-appointed task. By the time Melusine emerged through the dairy door, there were 5 goats tied up and munching and waiting to be milked. She stopped short and stared at the tethered goats. Her face was a blank. He simply couldn't tell if she were pleased or angry, and he was annoyed to find his heart thumping as if in fear. She abruptly turned, disappeared back into the dairy, emerged with her stool and pail, and crossed the pen, took up her milking position beside the first of the goats. "Puis-je essayer de traiter?" he asked. Her face was hidden, pressed to a goat's flank. The milk dringed steadily into the pail. After a moment, she muttered, "What is traire in English?" "To milk. You want to milk?" "Oui. It is hard to do it. Let me just try. Essaye." After another moment, she moved aside, still holding the pail, and he took her place on the 3-legged stool. It didn't seem very secure, and he felt strange and uncomfortable. She took his kneecaps in her smooth, rough, warm, cold hands and pressed them against the sides of the pail. Then, without touching the goat, she showed him how to squeeze with a downward movement, the top fingers squeezing first and the little fingers last. He tried the movement a few times in the air, and at last she indicated that he might take hold of the teats. They were hot and rubbery, and touching them made him shudder with a strange disgust at first. The goat was equally disgusted. It lifted its head from the grass, and he felt it half crouch, as if it meant to kick him. But Melusine held its head and spoke to it while he tried to put her lesson into practice. He squeezed, he pulled, he did everything he knew, including will the milk to emerge, but absolutely not a drop. Finally, he got so frustrated, he just let himself slump off the stool backwards into the mucky straw. "Grrr!" he shouted. "C'est impossible! C'est impossible!" Try that one more time. "C'est impossible!" The worst was, she would laugh at him again, but this time she didn't. "Ce n'est pas impossible. Impossible. Ce n'est pas impossible. Mais c'est difficult. Mais c'est difficile. Look me." She bent and showed him, moving her fingers very slowly and strongly, drawing the milk down the teat with a sinuous movement of her hand that reminded him of something swallowing. It was fascinating. His hand went to the second teat, and he copied her exactly, and suddenly he felt the milk, felt how he had to draw it down from the bag into the teat, and on down and out it came. Only a little squirt, but it trickled into the bucket beside Melusine's steady stream. Excited, he pushed her aside, resumed his seat on the stool, and tried again with both hands. It was hard, but little by little he began to get the knack. At each squeeze, a tiny amount of milk came out, and after a while, just a little more. When Melusine wanted to take over from him, he wouldn't give way. He was determined to finish at least one goat down to the last drop, but after a few more minutes, his hands began to ache, the skin at his index fingers to smart. The goat stamped her hoof and tossed her head irritably, and suddenly he got up. It wasn't that he couldn't go on a bit longer, but his fingers were hurting. What about the goat? She was used to being milked in 4 minutes. He watched Melusine expertly strip the last drops, and when she looked down at him with With a trace of a smile on her face, he grinned across his red and sweating one and said, I can milk. Je peux traire, n'est-ce pas? She nodded once again and replied, Oui, bien sûr. He felt as if she'd pinned a medal on him. When he got in for supper, Emma said, Whew, you stink. Shut up, said Roger. You do smell a bit, darling, said their mother, and good grief, look at the seat of your shorts. What have you been sitting in? Goat shit, said Roger. Fortunately, his mother was not too fussy about Anglo-Saxon words, at least when used in their correct context, and not as abuse, so she merely said dryly, Rather you than me. Go and change. And have a shower, Emma called after him. He met Polly coming out of the bathroom with wet hair. She too made a face and exaggeratedly held her nose. Pew, you stink, she said. They weren't twins for nothing, even though they were not identical. They were always together, and their minds seemed to work as one. Certainly about Roger, against whom they had ganged up practically from the moment they were born. He certainly couldn't remember a time when he had not felt that basically it was a case of 2 against 1. Yet he seemed to remember that when they were all younger, before he became a teenager, there had been long periods of truce during which they had managed to play together, support each other occasionally at school and in the street, while playing out, and even put their natural hostility aside sometimes to become a 3-person team. He had almost liked them then. Now his philosophical thoughts about them were limited to asking himself from time to time which of them he loathed more. His usual ploy was to ignore them, and he did this with Polly now, brushing past her and shutting himself into the steamy bathroom. Actually, it was a shower room. Roger had never had a shower before, not a real one. Polly had complained bitterly at lunch about not having a proper bath, and their father had said a shower was far cleaner, quicker, and more economic than bathing. Sitting in your own dirty water. And that he was seriously thinking of installing one at home. The girls had set up their invariable caterwauling at the prospect of any change from what they were used to, but Roger liked to think he was more flexible. He stripped off his clothes, adjusted the heat of the water, turned the handle on to full, and stepped into the shallow tiled square, drawing the plastic curtains around him. The minute he was in there and felt the warm water pouring over him from head to foot, he knew showers were for him. The gentle impact of separate streams could be individually felt on his face. He soaped himself all over and watched all the foam and dirt, there was a lot of both, carried down his body and vanishing down the drain. He saw at once exactly what his father meant. Fancy all that muck being still in the bathwater, with you soaking in it. This was much, much better. He wondered suddenly if Melusine had a shower. When this thought occurred to him, a picture came into his mind of her body, straight and slim, with her strange face turned upward to the shower head, her black hair wet and loose around her shoulders. The details were blurred by the spray, as if she were veiled. He shook his head sharply like a dog coming out of a river, and the picture went away. He stayed under the shower for ages. He liked it so much. Finally, his father came and banged on the door. You want your supper? Come on. He came out reluctantly, put on clean clothes, and slid into his chair at the kitchen table. Supper was soup from a tin, and the French bread, now gone completely crisp like a rusk. How did you get yourself in such a mess? Asked his father cheerfully. I was milking the goats. The girls looked at him. You don't know how, said Emma. Yes, I do, he said mildly. Melusine taught me. He waited for them to jeer at him in the mindless way they usually did, if he even mentioned a girl's name, but this time they didn't. Good for her, said his father. And good for you too, son. I learned to milk at about your age. When I spent a summer on a farm, it was cows, though, not goats. He flexed his hands, remembering. It takes forever to strip out a Jersey cow's udders. The girls sniggered idiotically. And for once he turned on them. Don't be so silly, you two. There's nothing funny about a cow's udders, let me tell you. And there's nothing easy about milking them. I had blisters on my hands for the first week. Did she give you some ointment to put on your hands before you started? No. I had to rub gobs of this thick white gunk into my hands to help them slip properly on the teats. At this, both girls broke into explosions of ill-suppressed mirth. Emma threw up her hands to her mouth to catch a spray of soup. Polly practically fell under the table. Teats! They wheezed. Teats! I'm going to hit them in a minute. I'm going to hit them in a minute, remarked their father, quite matter-of-factly to their mother, so you'd better stop them making that imbecile row. Leave the table, both of you, said their mother. Instead, they made a noble effort to pull themselves together. It wasn't an outstanding success, but at least they tried. Roger went on talking to his father as best he could through the snorts and snuffles. I wasn't very good. I couldn't even finish one goat. And it's only it's much less work than a cow, obviously. But I did do one thing that helped, and he told about the system with the tethers. While Melusine milked the other 4 goats he'd already caught, he caught and tethered a new lot. Then, while she worked her way steadily down the line, he released the milked ones. He was thinking while he did it. He could not see how she knew which ones she'd milked already from the dozens frisking about in the big pen. He certainly couldn't. If he was going to help her, it would be better if they had another pen to release the finished goats into, or perhaps a sort of fence that you could fix up temporarily across part of the main pen. He explained this to his father, who listened with great seriousness. That shouldn't present any problems, provided you can find some hurdles, or failing that, just a couple of ropes stretched across would keep them in for that short time you'd need. Maybe I'll stroll round and... But then he became aware that his wife was giving him eye signals, and he stopped. Oh, no, quite right. This is your territory, Roger. You can solve it, I'm sure. You'll no doubt revolutionize the system. In bed that night, Roger gave the matter some thought. Rope was a good idea, obviously the simplest solution. There was quite a long piece of rope, coiled in the trunk of the car for emergencies. He'd get up early in the morning and try it out before she arrived. Just as he was dropping off, his eyes snapped open. It was a faint enough sound, but he couldn't identify it. A sort of crinkly rustle, a little like the sound his mother made when she rubbed the ball of old tissue paper over a window pane to clean it. Only that it didn't go to and fro. It just went softly, whispering on and on. After a little while, and before he could exactly decide where it was in the room, it stopped. It was only when it stopped that Roger realized he had been holding his breath and that the hairs on the back of his neck were bristling. He thought he ought to get up, turn the light on, and search the room, but he didn't. It took him a long time to get to sleep after that. And that's the end of Chapter 5.